Welcome to Reporting and Responding to Child Abuse, a training for teacher candidates at Rhode Island College. After watching this training video, you will build awareness of the different types of child maltreatment, explore the presence of maltreatment in Rhode Island, build awareness regarding Rhode Island's mandatory reporting laws, build awareness of the Rhode Island Department of Children, Youth, and Families, also known as DCYF, and what their requirements and processes are for reporting suspected or known child maltreatment. And lastly, we'll review some tips for what you can do when you call DCYF's hotline 1-800-RI-CHILD. We're going to begin with some basic definitions and exploring the statistics related to the occurrence of maltreatment here in Rhode Island. I realize that many of you come from other states and potentially may not be teaching in Rhode Island schools. This training gives you an opportunity to consider the presence of maltreatment in schools and the importance of your role, but I also encourage you to find out within the schools that you're going to be teaching in what the protocols are, and if it's a different state, what the reporting laws require. Not all states require teachers, and Rhode Island requires everyone to report known or suspected child abuse, and some states just require certain professionals. So you should make sure that you know what the requirements are before you start practicing in a school. We're going to begin just with a brief video that helps us just kind of see abuse and neglect first in some concrete definitions, but also in a little bit of a broader context, which I have found to be really helpful in the years that I've been practicing.
You may have heard about child abuse and neglect. Do you know what they mean? They include acts of commission and omission and are preventable. Child abuse and neglect include acts of commission and omission. What are acts of commission? Acts of commission are deliberate and intentional. However, harm to a child might not be the intended consequence. Some examples include physical abuse, sexual abuse, psychological abuse. What are acts of omission? Acts of omission are the failure to provide for a child's basic physical, emotional, or educational needs, or to protect a child from harm or potential harm. Some examples include physical neglect, emotional neglect, medical and dental neglect, educational neglect, inadequate supervision, exposure to violent environments. About 1 in 7 children experience some form of child abuse or neglect in the last year. But we know the problem is underreported. That's why a consistent definition is so important. The good news is, we can stop child abuse and neglect before it starts. What can we do? We can work together to promote safe, stable, and nurturing relationships and environments so all children reach their full potential. Some strategies to consider include strengthen economic supports to families, change social norms to support parents and positive parenting, provide quality care and education early in life, enhance parenting skills to promote healthy child development, intervene to lessen harms and prevent future risk. These strategies help create families, neighborhoods, and communities where every child thrives.
Okay. One of the things that might stand out about that video is the fact that it cites a number of different factors that can make a difference in preventing and responding to abuse and neglect. And with those statements, I want to reinforce that school is a critical part of that. And given our current pandemic and the changed role of educators, this past spring, going into the early summer, the way you were teaching virtually, or if you have children in school, they were attending online, and we're still not 100% sure what the fall will bring. As someone who's been a practitioner for almost 30 years, I know that when I worked for DCYF many years ago, the school was a critical partner of mine. During the school year, I could count on teachers and school staff having eyes and ears on children for very long periods of time and multiple days a week, to the point where they really got to know children. And so if there was a change, oftentimes teachers were a partner of mine who would notice right away and who could intervene with a phone call to the DCYF hotline. Today, as we're interacting with children in different contexts, mostly virtual ones, it may be a little bit more challenging. And so I want to encourage you, as we go through the rest of this presentation, to think about how you can be attentive to any signs of abuse or neglect in the children and adolescents that you might be teaching, not only in person, but also online. So this video emphasized the importance of definitions. And I can't emphasize how right they are. Throughout my career, the opportunity to perceive issues of child maltreatment through the same lens really made it easier for me to communicate and to build partnerships with people. By knowing about child maltreatment definitions, and that we are talking about actual harm, potential harm, or the threat of harm, and providing a context of acts of omission versus those acts of commission, really helped me to be able to reinforce what was reportable in situations where people's concerns could not be responded to by the Department of Children, Youth, and Families. As educators, this perspective is really important, because it can be frustrating when you're concerned about a child and you make a call to the DCYF hotline and they're not able to respond because it doesn't meet the legal definition that they're allowed to act on. So understanding that abuse, physical or sexual or emotional, is about committing or perpetrating an act against a child that causes them harm, and that neglect is the opposite. It's not doing something to a child. It's not doing something to a child. It's omitting an act of caretaking that causes a child to be neglected. Let's look at some of the statistics here in Rhode Island. And I encourage you to look up other states, either that you come from or that you'll teach in, to see what the ages and types of maltreatment present. These data are taken from the 2020 Rhode Island Kids Count Fact Book, which is a tremendous resource. And one of the nice things about it is that you can actually access the entirety of that book online. They publish it on an annual basis. It has tremendous data about education, about poverty, about health and safety, and it can be a real resource for an educator. So first, let's look at maltreatment by age of victim. And these data represent calls into the DCYF hotline during the year 2019. Here you can see that over 3,200 calls for maltreatment were made to the hotline, and that the breakdown of them, if you just look at the percentages, from 0 to age 5, we have 42% of the calls, which reminds us of the vulnerability of young children. The fact that 30% of those calls were for kids 0 to 3. And when you think about the development of verbal skills and children's reliance on caretakers for shelter, food, protection, we can understand why 42% of the calls to the hotline may have been made for Rhode Island's youngest children. The next biggest caveat, we have our latency age, kind of coming from that getting into your elementary school level all the way up to age 11, 33% of the calls were made for that population. This is where we tend to see kids definitely enrolled in school. Hopefully the 0 to 5, we've had some positive experiences with early childhood education and daycare, which may be a source of some of these reports. And then the next group that we see are 12 and older, and that accounts for 25% of the calls. Oftentimes when I do this presentation for Rhode Island College, there are questions about the vulnerability of adolescents, and we tend as a society to see adolescents as being on the verge of independence, being capable of removing themselves from difficult situations, making sure that they get to school, making sure that they get food. And I think as a result, we may have a tendency to underproject the vulnerability of this population. And I want to encourage you that just as we can easily identify why children 0 to 6 are vulnerable, our adolescents are vulnerable also. We have societal expectations of them that sometimes are miss the point that they still need to be cared for. They still need to have a source of support for their basic needs as well as their social and emotional needs. And just because you're 16 years old and you're big enough to walk out of the door if there's abuse happening in your home, doesn't mean that you will. A, the caretakers are people that you have a relationship with, which adds a complexity. And B, sometimes adolescents are caring for younger siblings, which can make it very difficult for them to remove themselves. We also have tremendous amounts of development and conflict going on socially, emotionally, and intellectually during this phase of development that makes young people vulnerable. You have experimentation, potentially with substances, kind of the emergence of sexual activity, sexual identity, gender identity, different things that require additional support. And for kids who are vulnerable and who don't have that, we might see more instances of risk behaviors. And so I just want to encourage those of you teaching in high school to give your adolescents the same care and connection that you would give to younger children. If we look at the other side of the screen to the type of neglect and abuse, this may surprise some of you. I think when we think about maltreatment, issues of physical and sexual abuse tend to be what pop into people's minds. But year after year, neglect represents in the high 70s to low 80s. And I started working with DCYF back in the early 90s. And this statistic has not changed in this state, nor has it changed nationally. So let you know what a critical issue neglect is. One of the challenges with neglect is, unlike physical and sexual abuse, which can leave evidence, you can see evidence of that having occurred, neglect is invisible. Neglect is not having the right clothes, a child coming to school hungry, and is it because they didn't like the food that was served last night, or is it because there is no food? And is there no food because the parent's unable to provide it and not providing it, or is there something else going on? Many years ago as a caseworker, working with families where neglect was the dominant issue of maltreatment represented some of my greatest challenges. It's easier for me to talk to someone about why hitting a child isn't going to change behavior and is going to make things worse, and the damage that it can do. And the same is true of sexual abuse. But when it comes to neglect, which there are two kinds, there's acute neglect, which happens, due to a circumstance, potentially a family becoming homeless, a parent's mental health diagnosis, maybe a parent struggling with addiction, where once they get stabilized and they get some assistance, they can change the behavior. But there's also something called chronic neglect, which tends to be intergenerational. And it can be behaviors that are learned where parents really don't have the basic insight about how to care for a child. And it's very difficult and requires a lot of support. It's not impossible to intervene on behalf of this type of maltreatment, but it requires a lot of support. And again, school can play a tremendous role in identifying it and then also helping us to provide supports. So we know from this statistic that in 2019, 81% of the calls to the hotline were for neglect. I want to just make sure that we recognize here that calls don't have to distinctively be for this one category of neglect, physical abuse, sexual abuse, medical neglect, or emotional abuse. But in fact, someone could call the hotline and report a combination of types of maltreatment. And so this accounts for even when they are co-occurring. So we see here that as educators, one of the places that you're going to have to really be vigilant is in the area of neglect. Then we see the next most common type of maltreatment is physical abuse. And then it goes down from there with 4% of the cases being reported related to sexual abuse. And then medical neglect and emotional abuse accounted for less than 3 of the cases. I want to point out something about the sexual abuse statistic. First of all, we know due to culture, due to issues of gender roles, due to the level of secrecy that can exist where sexual abuse is perpetrated within family systems, we know that it is very likely underreported. So I don't want to give the impression that only 4% of maltreatment is sexual abuse. This here accounts for those instances of sexual abuse as a type of maltreatment that were called into the hotline. And I think that collectively, we know that there are instances of maltreatment that don't get reported. So we want to really be vigilant when we're looking at these different situations. Let's turn our attention to who perpetrates these abuses called into the hotline. When DCYF receives a call, one of the requirements under the law, which we'll check out in a second, is that the perpetrator has to be a parent or caretaker of the child. So the statistics that we're viewing are specific to those relationships between children and their caretakers. These statistics do not account for non-caretakers, such as a stranger, such as someone in a community organization, someone in a neighborhood. It also doesn't account for abuse perpetrated by other adolescents or children. This is specific to that really complex relationship that is built between children and adolescents and the people who care for them. And that relationship's complexity is something that can make intervening and providing support difficult, because children love their parents. Children don't want to leave their parents. They don't want their parents to get into trouble. So there are lots and lots of different layers. But when we're talking about the DCYF data, and when we're talking about what's reportable to DCYF, we're specifically thinking about parents and anyone who is deemed a caretaker of that child. Schools are included in this, but they, as you'll find out in a little bit, they get reported a little bit differently. DCYF investigates school allegations of abuse in a different context, because you certainly are a caretaker of the child. But the nuance is just slightly different. So when we look at perpetrators of maltreatment against children, we see that 93% of the calls that were made in 2019 were for abuse and neglect perpetrated by parents, followed by a small number, 3% of relatives or other household members. That could be a parent, significant other. It could be extended family members living in the home. We also see foster parents, that there have been instances of maltreatment reported where foster parents are the perpetrators in 1% of the cases. Child care providers, DCYF and the Department of Human Services both play roles at different levels of early care and education providers. And so we can see some of that here. And then the other one that's clearly defined is that of residential staff. So where children are in a residential program. But by and large, we can see here that the place that we really need to be attentive is that relationship between the parents and the children. And so this tells me that as educators, one of our most important relationships after building a relationship with a child or adolescent is really knowing the caretaker of that child and having some way to have access to them or build a relationship, which is much easier, I realize, when you have kids in elementary school where you're interacting with parents or in daycare and childcare facilities. As kids get older, they move away from that reliance on parents. And some of you may struggle. My husband's a middle school math teacher, and he struggles sometimes with the lack of parent presence because parents are having to work multiple jobs. Some parents are struggling with lots and lots of different social challenges. And so even in middle school, I'm starting to hear my colleagues talk about some of the challenges with relationships with parents. But this just lets you know how critical they are. And if we can be insightful about needs and make support connections for families, we might be able to intervene on some of the issues that cause stress in families, and that can help parents reach out if they are having difficulty. So let's look just quickly at some signs of maltreatment. Now certainly we may have children talk to us. We may make observations. There are different things that you can look for. So I'm going to show those in a second. Typically, when I've talked to educators, they share concerns related to, gee, this person's grade slipped, or, you know, they've just been acting out, stealing other kids' lunches. They seem kind of down lately. They can't get enough to eat. I've seen them skip class and go into 2 lunches. Physical appearance, being disheveled or unclean. Their relationships with peers changing. Either they're isolating, or maybe they're starting to hang out with a group of youth or other kids who they normally don't, and that gives you some concern. You might see evidence of the schoolwork that they're making or conversations that they're having that gives you a reason for concern. And you might see things that don't make sense to you, and the only thing that you're thinking is something's got to be going on at home. Mostly when we're talking about signs of maltreatment, you're noticing, because of the amount of time that you spend with your students, you're noticing that something is different. And so let's look at what some of those kind of things might be. The most obvious is when kids are able to tell us, hey, something happened to me, you know, at home, this happened, right? That makes it a lot easier. Tanya said this happened, and then you notify your school and you report it to the hotline. Or you have kids making statements, not specifically about abuse or neglect, but about, wow, mommy was gone again and I made breakfast. I did a good job making eggs. And you're thinking, okay, this child is 6. They should not be making eggs. And this is the 3rd day this week that they talked about waking up and not having someone at home. So in these situations, kids aren't intentionally disclosing abuse or neglect. They're processing what's happening to them in a way that they may not even be aware it is going to trigger a call to DCYF. Next, we have physical signs. And again, these are some of those obvious ones. We want to take the physical signs into consideration with a child's age and their abilities. If you're at a daycare facility, if you're working with young children who are just learning to walk, bruises on the knees are not uncommon as kids are kind of getting their bearings. However, if you have a 6-year-old whose legs are bruised up and down, you know, you're going to be a little bit more concerned about that. So when we think about physical signs, we're looking at unexplained bruises, welts, abrasions, and burns. When we're thinking about potential signs of sexual abuse, However, sometimes there can be physical abuse that is targeted at children's or adolescents' genitals. You're thinking of bruising, bleeding, pain, or itching. Some of these you might notice as behavioral symptoms with children just kind of fidgeting or scratching themselves. In other situations, it might be maybe an older student coming and asking to go to the nurse for some difficulty. Also physical signs, inappropriate clothes depending upon the weather, right? So kids who are coming to school, without the appropriate clothing in the winter could be a cue. However, I know I have a 20 and a almost 18-year-old, and I remember when my son pretty much wanted to wear shorts going all the way through December, and I thought, oh my God, this is just not right. But then it became a matter of, pick your battles, and if it's cold, he's going to put something on. But a teacher might have looked at him and said, gee, is something going on at the glances? This is something you kind of look at over time, and you might have a conversation, and you might kind of know whether or not that's a trend in your school, but it's something to watch for. Behavioral signs. You might have kids who are afraid to return home, who might demonstrate some fear toward parents. This might be more evident in K through 12, like kind of your younger end of the classes where you are interacting with the parents. How kids interact with adults, if they're afraid, if you get up in front of them and they pull back. Consistent hunger, poor hygiene, inappropriate dress. So part of these, the clothing piece can be a physical sign, but these other pieces, if you've ever had children who come to school and they don't smell good and no one wants to sit next to them, or I've worked with families where, we discovered something was wrong because the child was stealing lunches in the little, the coat room where people's lunch boxes were. And we found out that the family only had enough food to feed the younger siblings. And they felt that because their, 6-year-old was going to be in school and would have access, that they could get their food there. This is a situation where the parents were trying to meet the needs of their children, assessing what the resources were, but that their older child was going to bed hungry every single night. That was an opportunity to connect the family with resources. It wasn't an intentional abuse or neglect situation, but if that family continued not to be able to provide food for that child, it certainly would have evolved into that. Explicit reports, sexual acting out, or stories by the child of a sexual nature that would not necessarily be appropriate knowledge for their age. And so when you think about signs of maltreatment, it's really about your eyes and your ears, really taking stock of children's behavior, what they're saying, what they're not saying, what they're doing, how they look, and using that over time to really guide your interventions in support of them. I want to show a video just to reinforce how important schools are. The video's a little bit hard to watch because it's about a young man who grew up in a family with significant instances of domestic violence and child abuse perpetrated by his father. But in watching this, I was just reminded of how critical the child's school was. And he's going to talk about his relationship with a coach. And so when we think about schools, teachers have probably the most consistent time. However, kids build relationships with people in the office. If they have special education needs, they may build relationships with the multidisciplinary team. If children are playing any kind of sport, the relationship with the coach or the assistant coach, and even maintenance staff. Kids who go in early for free breakfast may, every day, they're seeing the person who's putting out the food. And everyone in between. And so I want to just reinforce how important the school is as an environment. And this video just helps us to remember why we need to be vigilant in the important role that we play.
where they're playing, it's where my brother and I would play. My dad, he would come home and we had to be really good at sports and stuff, so. There's one time where we were sitting, I knew it was coming. I knew my brother, Bobby, I knew that he would be the one to bear the brunt of it. And so I'm sorry. I'm sorry.
Chad reminds me of a lot of the kids that come through here. Angry, very angry. And you could tell he just didn't want to connect with anybody. And you could tell he was hiding something. He always came in with a nervous stomach. My stomach hurts, my stomach hurts. And he finally came clean and told me his father had major anger issues. He said, you know, I need to talk to somebody. And I instantly thought of Coach Morrow.
Chad wasn't a football player per se. He was just a kid that had energy that needed to do something. He needed to be a part of something because I don't think he had anyone as a role model or someone showing him what to do.
On the whistle, Coach Morrow was the only person I really trusted in this town. He was always there.
There was times I would give him a ride home. We would talk, sometimes we wouldn't talk. But it was interesting to have a discussion with someone, a young man who had no one to talk to.
He was the only one there for my graduation. Even my family wasn't there.
You're doing good. You're okay.
I just remember when you were walking across, I just remember looking up. You had this big old just ear to ear grin.
It takes a village to raise a child. And it doesn't matter what nationality, what race, we're all from the human race. And if you interact with someone, it shows them that you care.
Good memories, you know? You gotta hold on to those.
It's love thy neighbor. It's what we should do.
When's the last time you saw him?
About 8 years ago. And actually right over here is Lucille's barbecue. The best barbecue you'll ever have in your life. And Coach Morrow actually took me there, like after high school graduation. But take this right. It's gonna be your first right over there. Just pull in, not this one, but. I freaking knew it. I freaking knew it. I did too. I knew something was up.
No,
I knew something with that. I knew it. I knew you all doing something.
No, you didn't. There you go.
I heard you in town. I knew you couldn't pass up some Lucille's, man. Oh, good to see you. Proud of you. Done well. Done well.
Oh, pretty emotional and very powerful. When I think about the critical role that educators have played in helping children be more resilient and helping adolescents be more resilient. And one of the interesting things about that is you may never know that you've contributed to a child's resiliency. It may be the social worker like myself who's talking to them, you know, several years after that fact, who hears a story of a coach who was the only person at a child's graduation, or a coach or a teacher who made sure that they had a coat for the winter and was always there to talk and support them. And so a lot of the help that you offer is invisible, and you may never even have the benefit of sitting back and just really celebrating that contribution. But I can tell you, after almost 30 years in practice, that you make a tremendous difference, just like we just saw for this young man. So let's get into the mandatory reporting laws here in Rhode Island and what they are. So the law is Rhode Island General Law 40-11-3, and it's called mandated reporting. Its origins were in the Child Abuse Prevention and Treatment Act of 1976, which required all states to develop a process to support people reporting abuse or neglect, and to create a location, a department to receive and respond to those calls. The one place that they allowed states flexibility was in determining who was required to report. So who your mandated reporters were. In Rhode Island, we decided to interpret that very liberally because, and I would agree with this, we are all capable of identifying when something is not right in a family, and we should all have the responsibility to be able to share that information and provide intervention and support. So in Rhode Island, all persons are required by law to report known or suspected cases of child abuse or neglect to the Department of Children, Youth, and Families within 24 hours of becoming aware of such abuse or neglect. You notice here the words know or suspect. Sometimes something doesn't look right. You're not 100% sure. If you're acting in good faith, you need to still call that in. We have had instances, as you can imagine, over the years where, people during divorces or grandparents not feeling like they were getting access to their grandchildren, or neighbors getting angry and, making false allegations. Fortunately, the staff at DCYF are trained to kind of sort through all of those different pieces of information and determine what the validity is. However, if you suspect that a child is being abused or neglected, that's enough for you to make a call to the hotline. And the idea is that you do it within 24 hours so that they can intervene and assess the situation as soon as possible, and so that we don't prolong a child's risk or lack of safety. When you share the information, you're sharing, everything that you can offer to justify why you feel that the child is, a victim of abuse and neglect, and also you're making sure that you provide any data from your observations, specific information if a child has made a disclosure to you. You're getting ready when you make that phone call as an educator to share that information, so that the department knows the source of the information, knows the content, and can really act in response to that. If you happen to make a call and report abuse and neglect that turns out not to be true, provided that you're acting in good faith, you are immune from any civil or criminal liability. There are times where no abuse or neglect is happening, and the optic on the outside may look differently. Sometimes in these situations, we really want to consider cultural context. We want to consider socioeconomic context, and we want to make sure that we're thinking about the bottom line about a child being at risk or unsafe. And just because everybody in a certain school wears certain clothes or has access to certain resources, and because one family doesn't necessarily mean that those parents are being abusive or neglectful. I remember back in the 80s when we had lots of immigrants coming from Southeast Asian countries. There was a major issue with the department misreading care being provided within that community by parents to their children in a process called coining, which is a healing ritual where coins would be rubbed on a child for illness, and it would leave a mark that looked very much like a bruise. The department was not familiar with the cultural practices and unfortunately didn't take the time to become familiar with them when this population of people started to have an increased presence in Rhode Island. And the consequence was going out, and I'm sure schools had a role in this, reporting that they were seeing these bruises. So there was a lack of cultural awareness and competence on all of our parts. And there were many investigations and even some removals, and it took a while for that community to intervene and provide education to the department. And it took even longer for the department to really work on having a healthy relationship and making amends. And so we want to really think about those cultural contexts as we're, as we're reporting stuff. That being said, if it's a cultural practice to use a belt to discipline, and that use of a belt leaves a mark, that's where the cultural competence has to kind of switch to, okay, what else can be done for you to provide discipline to your child that doesn't break the law? Because in Rhode Island, we're not allowed to discipline our children where we leave marks. So it's a little bit of a dance, but just wanted to offer that example. On the flip side, if you know that a child is being abused or neglected and you don't do anything, you can actually be fined and you can serve time in prison for that. And so really understanding the protocols within your school. If there's an instance where you think or know a child is being abused or neglected and it doesn't get reported, there's a consequence for that. This last bullet here, I want to provide a little caveat to. It says that all records concerning reports of abuse and neglect, including reports made to the hotline, are confidential and must not be disclosed except when otherwise permitted by law. I can tell you, having sat in a number of arraignments, as well as neglect and abuse trials and termination of parental rights trials, there are two things to consider here. When you call the hotline in your capacity as an educator, you're making that call as a professional. You're basing it on your observations, what you're trained to do in your classroom, and why what you're seeing in a certain child stands out as not being within the norm. I encourage educators and professionals to always call and identify who they are. It adds legitimacy to your report, and it makes it kind of puts you in a little bit more of a control position. I know we get concerned about our relationships with kids and families, but I have made it a practice my entire career to let people know that, one of the things that is my duty as a mandated reporter in Rhode Island is if I think something is wrong, if something's going on and someone's getting hurt, I have a duty. I've had parents, I've told parents that I'm making a call. I've had, to make those calls with children. And so it's important to know that there's more power in identifying who you are. That being said, it is not unusual as an arraignment or a trial progresses from these allegations that you may be called in to testify, at which time the department's always going to know who you are. The court will know who you are. You may be required to come into court, and then your confidentiality really, is out the window. And so I like to encourage people to, to step up and do the right thing right from the get-go. When we think about what's reportable in terms of abuse and neglect, you have a list in your handouts, and it reflects the categories on this slide. Again, really wanting to take into account the different cultures that you're going to be working with. And for instance, lack of supervision in some cultures. I know I come from an Italian-Irish background, and, I had a role of having to watch my younger siblings by the time I was 11. In some cultures that could be older, it could be younger. The level of care that older siblings give to younger siblings might not match what you do in your culture or what I do in mine. And we might think that that's being, resulting in parentification of your student, and you're concerned about that. You have to go back to that idea of, is a child being damaged? Is harm being done to that child, or will harm be done to that child because of this? And so sometimes what we might see as a lack of supervision, when it gets called into the department, it doesn't rise to that level, because we might not be looking just purely through a maltreatment lens, but we might be looking through our own cultural lens. So we want to think about some of these possibilities. When you call DCYF and they receive a report of known or suspected abuse and neglect, they're forced to ask themselves really 3 questions. They're asking about the child's safety, their risk, and they're also asking something about protective factors. When we think about a child being unsafe, that is the highest area of concern that DCYF will have. And when a child is unsafe, they're unsafe because there is a threat of imminent maltreatment or re-maltreatment. So that means if we don't act right now, this child's hurt will continue or it will reoccur. When children are unsafe, DCYF's response is to typically respond in a very shortened time frame. When DCYF is assessing whether or not a child is at risk, it's a different level and taken equally as seriously, but it's about the likelihood of maltreatment occurring or reoccurring. So what you see here, the difference between likelihood and imminent are grades of severity. So when we're thinking about risk, if we're looking at, say, for instance, neglect and failure to meet basic needs, what's the likelihood that this child will continue to be at risk for maltreatment, for neglect, if we don't intervene? And so maybe the family didn't know that there was a food bank down the street, and the parents are working really hard to keep food on the table, but they're working so much just to pay rent and keep the heat on and the electricity in the winter that they really didn't have enough food, and they were hoping that the kids were eating enough at the school breakfast and lunch. There might be an opportunity to intervene, because the maltreatment doesn't necessarily have to continue if parents are connected to resources, or if they have a family care community partnership relationship. So DCYF would be assessing this. The other piece that's really critical, and when I teach classes on this, I've taught education majors at PC, and I teach students in early childhood education here, and I teach, graduate students. But the idea of protective factors, and even in the worst situations, we really need to be able to look holistically at families. And when DCYF gets your reports, they're also considering protective factors. They're looking for any qualities that can be understood and observed to be part of the way the parent thinks, feels, and acts that makes them protective. So I've worked with families where addiction is an issue, and say, for instance, the father is struggling with an opiate addiction. The mother does not use, and so she remains vigilant as a caretaking parent, even when that father maybe goes missing, doesn't allow the father to do drugs in the home. And so someone might call and say, I'm concerned that there's drugs being used in that home. When DCYF goes out, they're going to assess, are the children unsafe or at risk? They might determine that nothing bad has happened to the children, so there's not an imminent threat, but that the likelihood, if they come into contact or if that father is left with them, certainly could be a risk. But the mother becomes a protective factor, that she really is trying to provide support and buffer her children from the father's struggle with addiction. And it's important for us to realize, even in difficult situations, that all families, all of our students have strengths. And it's those strengths that really make it possible for us to build relationships that help families move beyond some of these issues of maltreatment to a place of functioning and health. Let's look a little bit about how schools report abuse. In schools, you have the same expectation that if you know or suspect child abuse, you have to transfer the information to DCYF. I know that some schools require that you notify a principal, or may have you go through the school social worker or school psychologist. The statute itself talks about the person with the knowledge making the call. So you have to negotiate that within the school settings that you're going to. However, I can tell you, if a decision is made not to make that call, there could be liability. And so following up and making sure that that call does happen. The other is if you know or suspect that a child has been the victim of sexual abuse by an employee, agent, contractor, or volunteer of your school setting, you must transfer that information to DCYF as well. And DCYF will immediately contact law enforcement, which is different than what typically happens, because typically they come out and they do the investigation. And the law enforcement piece is only brought in when there are going to be criminal charges. So here we're talking about two different statuses, abuse and neglect, and then they have a whole different category for sexual abuse. The Department of Education here in Rhode Island has a whole website, and I'm actually going to include it in your handout packets. There's a handout for, very intensive handout for reporting sexual abuse and neglect. Historically, the manual that they give to teachers was not updated, and due to incidents that happened within the last 2 to 3 years, the focus on reporting sexual abuse has become heightened, and a very specific guidance has been issued. I want you to be just as vigilant with all types of maltreatment. And so here you can see that who is the mandated reporter. They're talking about everyone, so they're upholding what the statute says. It's telling you what to do, that you can call if the suspicion is of child abuse, that you can call the hotline directly. So here, RIDE is giving guidance to the schools that if you as a teacher candidate just finds this information out, you can make that call. A teacher can make the call. Anyone in the school can make the call. If the abuse is sexual in nature and was perpetrated by an employee of the school or a volunteer of the school, then you're required to notify your principal or the person in charge. And that person must notify the superintendent of that district, who then contacts DCYF. And so you can see here just that separation of your responsibility when it's about abuse or neglect, but when it's about sexual abuse that's perpetrated by someone in the school, then you can see that the level of reporting is somewhat different, and they're also making sure that you're notifying the chain of command. For those of you who might not know, the hotline, 1-800-RI-CHILD, is also 1-800-742-4453. And you can make that phone call if you're calling directly to report instances of abuse and neglect. And that same number will get called by your administrators if there's a report of sexual abuse perpetrated by someone within the school. So let's talk a little bit about what happens when a child discloses abuse or neglect, and you know, what you might do to respond. There are some do's and don'ts, and I can tell you, as someone who has received disclosures probably in the hundreds, it's really difficult. The first thing that gets triggered in you is a sadness and an anger that someone has hurt a child. The next is you have this kind of compulsion to want to protect them. I want to encourage you, when you receive this information, because in your career at some point, it is very likely that you will, I want you to remember to take a breath, to be present for that child or adolescent, and to be very careful about your use of self in the situation. I want you to be able to listen and hear what they're saying to you. I want you to affirm what they're saying. Let them know that you believe them. That is really, really incredibly important. I want you to let them know that it's not their fault. Oftentimes when children disclose abuse and neglect, they run the risk of being the person who has the most to lose. They're the ones who'll get removed from home. They may get separated from siblings. Their parents could get in trouble. And so the weight of responsibility on children and adolescents when they make these disclosures is substantial. And it's important to let them know that it wasn't their fault, and that what they're doing has the ability to get some help for that family. You can let that child know that with that information that they've shared, you're going to contact DCYF to try to help stop the abuse. These are the things that you can do. You have no ability to predict the future, and you don't have the ability to investigate these disclosures, right? So you want to maintain that role as educator. What you don't want to do, although your heart sometimes pulls you in this direction, you don't want to make promises that you can't keep. We want to be very upfront with students and families that we work with, letting them know that we're mandated reporters and that you don't have the ability to keep this kind of information to yourself. And so I like to begin my relationship with whether it's youth or children or adults by letting them know that I'm a mandated reporter. You don't want to push the child's disclosure by asking them questions, almost taking on the role of an investigator or a detective. One is you want the child to be able to just get this statement, get this disclosure out of them, and you just want to be there for support. And the other reason that we don't encourage you to kind of delve into details is that you're not the investigator. And actually by asking questions, you can adversely impact the forensic data that then comes out of that child. You could cause them to make a connection that wasn't there, which then could affect the viability of the investigation going forward. You don't want to ask questions. Well, why do you think that happened to you? Or why didn't that happen to your younger sibling? Again, you're just there as a receptacle of information and to provide support. And the other thing, beyond maybe in all of your situations, you're a teacher leader, you don't want to discuss the information that's been shared with you. One of the hard things, and in the next video training on trauma, one of the things that we'll talk a little bit about is the reciprocal trauma that happens to us when we're a partner in either being exposed to trauma that happens to other people, or there's trauma in our work setting. And sometimes it can be really difficult when a child discloses something and you're holding on to that. You should find out within your school setting, and it might be your teacher leader that you're working with, or it might be someone in the school social work department, where you can go and process this. It's really important that you take care of yourself, but you can't take care of yourself by taking the information that child gave you and giving it to a bunch of other people, and you violate their confidence. And you also keep reliving what they told you, and you're not really getting any help for yourself. One of the things you can do is when you call this into the hotline, you can put your faith in DCYF to be able to do this investigation, that they are trained forensically to gather these pieces of data and to use them to inform a decision about how to respond. And when you talk to DCYF, you can just assure them of the things that you did do, and know that you can reinforce with them that you did not ask any additional questions, and you can offer yourself as a resource should they have questions going forward. You want to think about your chain of command when this is happening. You certainly don't want to keep a disclosure to yourself. So you're going to share the concern with the teacher. You may have a protocol in your school, and I encourage you to find this out. All schools do not operate the same in terms of what the chain of command for allegations of abuse and neglect are. Some of them require notice to the principal, others to the school psychologist. They actually probably will provide support with you to make the phone call. However, I have had situations where schools have not been supportive, and I have always instructed the student teacher that they still need to make the phone call because you are a mandated reporter. And then, you may actually have your cooperating teacher or one of the other folks in the chain of command who will say, we'll sit with you while you make that call and give you that support. That has been the majority of my experience with teacher candidates, that they get a lot of support around this. When you call DCYF's hotline, you want to be ready with critical pieces of information. You want to know the child's name, their age, their birth date, and what grade they're in. You want to tell them what school you're calling from, where the school is, and the school's phone number. If there is information on file at that school for the child's family, where they live, the telephone number, names of family members, that's going to be critical. And then you're going to share information, A, about the disclosure, and B, about your observations related to the child. If you don't know that the abuse is happening, but you suspect, you're going to offer them support for why you think this is the case, and think back to some of those signs that we reviewed earlier. You're going to offer your own contact information. In some cases, DCYF will begin an investigation, and they may circle back around with secondary questions. And sometimes it's not a case of maltreatment, but a situation where a family needs support, and maybe DCYF will reach out to the school to be a partner in kind of creating that support for that child and family. And so this is an opportunity for you to build a relationship with the department so that together you can support this student and their family. So let's, as we're coming to the end of our training video, let's kind of just talk about some helpful hints in the process. First of all, I want to tell you from experience, I have called DCYF as a neighbor, I've called as a family member, and I've certainly called many years ago when I was an employee of DCYF. There are certain things that really didn't change regardless of my role. It was always a difficult call to make because I knew the consequence potentially could be a child getting removed from a family. I also knew that it might come to nothing. And then I would have to be even more vigilant because, really was there something else going on? And I worked with families where for years people suspected sexual abuse in a family of 3 siblings, but could never prove it. And it wasn't until that family was opened, I want to say for 6 years, that finally a disclosure came from a child. And I remember poring over the records and going all the way back to when the oldest child had been born, and the concerns that were placed in the record, and reading through years and years of documentation. And it was painful for me to know that all of this time, this horrific abuse had been being perpetrated, and there just never was enough. And the regret that I felt for the system having failed responding to these kids. And so I wanna tell you that it's always a very emotional experience, even when you're doing something that ultimately is going to help a family. Very mixed. The other piece is there are things that you can do to really increase your credibility and your clarity, and just try to give yourself a little bit of control in that situation to help manage the impact that it has on you. First, I have found, and my colleagues who do this for a living, who are investigators at DCYF, would rather have the person who has either seen the evidence or has received the allegation. So if that's you, they would rather have you call in with the report, rather than you telling your cooperating teacher or the school psychologist and them calling it. So first person testimony is always the best. They're going to ask you questions, right? They're going to ask questions about identifying information. This goes back to that earlier slide about being able to call in and maintain confidentiality. I'm encouraging you not to do that. Your confidentiality cannot be guaranteed, and it adds legitimacy if you call and say, hi, my name is Tanya Glantz, and I am a teacher preparation candidate at Roger Williams School working under, Jeff Glantz in his math classes, right? And maybe Jeff Glantz would be calling with me or the principal, but making sure that you have all that information. The reason that they have the requirement for calling within 24 hours is so that they can be very proactive in responding. Know that when you call, your call is going to be recorded. And so they have the ability to go back and review that for data. If you feel at any point in time that someone, isn't treating you well, those calls are also recorded and can be reviewed for that content as well. DCYF is not, screaming from the top of the roof, that you called and you made this. You can remain anonymous, but I'm encouraging you not to. And if on the call you feel like you're not able to get questions answered, or you're not happy with the way things are being handled, you can always ask to speak to a supervisor. I would like to tell you, if you think back to the slide where we looked at the data for abuse and neglect being reported in 2019, I think it was over 3,400 calls. So when you call, if you feel like they're being kind of short and rushing you, it's because in a year, they will be getting over 3,400 calls. And so they need to be very efficient on this initial interaction where you're reporting abuse and neglect. And so that requires them moving you through this process so that they can act within that 24-hour period and determine if they have to get out there immediately and whom else they need to get involved. And so if they're trying to move you through, don't take that as them being rude. It's them being efficient so that they can do the work of responding to the needs of the child that you're calling about. The other piece that's really important is documenting your actions. I like to say that you should write down, I received this allegation from my student Tanya Glantz. I notified my cooperating teacher and we met with the principal and we called the hotline. Your school should have a form that is used to document it. If they don't, feel free to write it just as a note for yourself, and then I would also submit it to your cooperating teacher. Include the date and time. Make sure you write down when you make that phone call to DCYF who the person that you spoke with, and then sign it. I think it's critical that you keep a copy of this for yourself as well as providing it to the school leadership. The original child abuse reporting form should be maintained by you. When you get into your schools, I would find out what that protocol is, because again, in my experience training schools on mandatory reporting and child abuse, each school has been operating very differently. So as you get ready to enter your student teaching for the fall semester of 2020, I want to wish you well. I certainly hope that you get to do so in person. And know that even if you're doing it virtually, you continue to represent a critical support for students in their academic and social growth, but also in helping to keep them safe. I hope you find this information helpful. In your handout packets, you'll receive copies of all of the slides, as well as the manual from RIDE related to reporting sexual abuse, and some additional materials that will help you as you kind of consider making calls to the DCYF hotline. Thank you so much and good luck this year.